Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed and prepare to drift into peaceful slumber, allow me to guide you through one of the most captivating and timeless tales from ancient Greek mythology. This is a story that has echoed through the corridors of human consciousness for over 2,000 years, a narrative so profound that it continues to shape our understanding of ambition, creativity, and the delicate balance between dreams and reality. The story of Icarus begins not with the young man himself, but with his father Daedalus, whose name has become synonymous with ingenious craftsmanship and innovative design. In the ancient world, to call someone a Daedalus was to acknowledge them as a master artisan, someone whose skills transcended ordinary human capability and approached the divine realm of creation itself. This legendary figure would become both the architect of miracles and the unwitting creator of tragedy, demonstrating how the greatest gifts can sometimes lead to the most devastating consequences. Let your breathing slow as we journey back to ancient Greece, to an age when gods walked among mortals and the boundaries between the possible and impossible were far more fluid than they appear today. Picture the Mediterranean sun casting long shadows across marble columns and bustling marketplaces, where stories of divine intervention and human folly were as common as the daily bread. In this world of myth and wonder, our tale unfolds with all the complexity and beauty that has made it endure across countless generations. Daedalus was born in Athens, that great city of learning and artistry that would later become the cradle of democracy and philosophical thought. From his earliest years, he displayed an almost supernatural ability to understand how things worked, how they could be improved, and most importantly, how entirely new creations could be brought into existence. His hands seemed to possess an innate wisdom that allowed him to shape wood, stone, and metal into forms that had never existed before, each creation more remarkable than the last. The young artisan's reputation grew with each passing year as word spread throughout Greece about his extraordinary abilities. Nobles and commoners alike would travel great distances just to witness his work, and many would offer substantial sums for even the smallest creation from his workshop. His sculptures were said to be so lifelike that observers would swear they had seen them move, breathing with an essence that seemed almost alive. His architectural designs defied conventional understanding, incorporating innovations that other builders could barely comprehend, let alone replicate. But Daedalus possessed more than mere technical skill. He had the rarer gift of imagination, the ability to envision solutions to problems that others considered impossible to solve. Where most craftsmen worked within established traditions and accepted limitations, Daedalus questioned everything, constantly pushing against the boundaries of what was considered achievable. This relentless pursuit of innovation would eventually lead him to heights of fame and creativity that few mortals have ever reached, but it would also set in motion the events that would bring both triumph and heartbreak to his family. As his fame spread throughout the Greek world, Daedalus attracted students who hoped to learn from his mastery. Among these apprentices was his nephew Talos, a young man who showed remarkable promise and seemed to inherit something of his uncle's innovative spirit. Talos possessed a sharp mind and nimble fingers, qualities that allowed him to grasp concepts quickly and execute them with impressive precision. Under Daedalus's guidance, the young man began to develop skills that suggested he might one day rival his teacher's abilities. However, what should have been a source of pride and joy for Daedalus gradually became a source of growing unease. As Talos continued to improve, demonstrating flashes of brilliance that occasionally surpassed even his master's work, Daedalus found himself confronting emotions he had never expected to feel. The teacher, who had always been secure in his supremacy, began to experience the bitter taste of jealousy, watching as his nephew's innovations sometimes exceeded his own in elegance and effectiveness. The turning point came when Talos invented the compass and the saw, two tools that would revolutionize craftsmanship for generations to come. The compass, inspired by observing how a serpent's jawbone naturally formed a perfect curve, allowed artisans to create precise circles and arcs with unprecedented accuracy. The saw, developed after Talos noticed how the serrated edge of a fish's spine could cut through tough materials, transformed woodworking and stonework throughout the Mediterranean world. These inventions established Talos as an innovator in his own right, no longer merely a student following in his uncle's footsteps. Unable to bear the thought that his nephew might surpass him and claim the recognition that he had worked so hard to achieve, Daedalus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In a moment of jealous rage, he pushed Talos from the roof of the Athenian Acropolis, watching in horror as the young man fell to his death on the rocks below. The goddess Athena, who had been watching these events unfold, took pity on Talos even as he fell, transforming him into a partridge that flew away to safety. But the damage to Daedalus's soul was already complete. The murder of his nephew marked the end of Daedalus's life in Athens. When the crime was discovered, he faced prosecution and certain execution, forcing him to flee his homeland and seek refuge elsewhere. This exile would take him far from the familiar streets and workshops of Athens, leading him to the island of Crete, where his greatest triumphs and most devastating tragedy would unfold. Sometimes the paths that seem to lead us away from disaster actually guide us toward our most defining moments, and Daedalus's journey to Crete would prove to be exactly such a path. King Minos of Crete welcomed the famous artisan with open arms, recognizing immediately the value of having such a skilled craftsman in his service. Crete was at the height of its power during this period, controlling vast trade networks throughout the Mediterranean and accumulating wealth that allowed for ambitious construction projects. Minos had been seeking someone with the vision and ability to create something truly extraordinary, a monument that would demonstrate Crete's supremacy and his own divine mandate to rule. Daedalus found in Minos a patron who appreciated his abilities and provided him with unlimited resources to pursue his craft. The king's commissions allowed the exiled artisan to work on a scale he had never before imagined, creating structures and mechanisms that pushed the boundaries of engineering and artistry to their absolute limits. For a time, it seemed as though Daedalus had found the perfect situation, a place where his talents could flourish without the constraints and jealousies that had plagued his earlier career. The most famous of Daedalus's creations for King Minos was the Labyrinth, an underground maze so complex and disorienting that anyone who entered it without knowledge of its secrets would become hopelessly lost. This architectural marvel was designed to contain the Minotaur, a creature born from Queen Pasiphae's unnatural union with a sacred bull, a being so dangerous and unpredictable that it could not be allowed to roam free among the population. The labyrinth represented the pinnacle of Daedalus's architectural achievement, incorporating principles of design that seemed to defy logical understanding. The corridors twisted and turned in patterns that confused the mind, leading visitors through seemingly endless passages that doubled back on themselves in ways that made navigation impossible. The walls rose high enough to prevent climbing, while the ceiling remained low enough to create a sense of oppression and claustrophobia that added to the psychological impact of being trapped within its confines. But Daedalus's creation was more than merely a prison. It was a work of art that demonstrated his understanding of human psychology and spatial relationships. Every turn, every dead end, every false passage was carefully planned to create maximum confusion while maintaining the structural integrity necessary to contain its monstrous inhabitant. The labyrinth became legendary throughout the ancient world, spoken of in whispered conversations as a testament to both human ingenuity and the darker purposes to which such ingenuity could be applied. For years, Daedalus lived comfortably in Crete, creating wonders for King Minos and enjoying the respect and admiration that his position brought him. He had a son, Icarus, who grew up in this environment of creativity and innovation, surrounded by the fruits of his father's genius. The boy showed an early fascination with his father's work, spending countless hours in the workshop watching as Daedalus shaped raw materials into objects of beauty and function. Icarus possessed his father's curiosity and enthusiasm for creation, though he lacked the patience and discipline that had made Daedalus such a master craftsman. Where his father would spend weeks perfecting a single detail, Icarus was eager to move on to the next project, driven by an excitement that sometimes outpaced his understanding of the consequences involved in such complex undertakings. The relationship between father and son deepened as Icarus matured, and Daedalus began to see in his child both the promise of continued artistic legacy and the familiar dangers of unbridled ambition. During long afternoons in the workshop, Daedalus would demonstrate the intricate techniques that had made him legendary, showing Icarus how to read the grain of wood, how to judge the quality of bronze, and how to envision the finished piece before making the first cut or strike. These teaching moments revealed the complexity of Daedalus's character, for while he genuinely loved his son and wanted to share his knowledge, he also carried within him the memory of what had happened with Talos. The fear that history might repeat itself created a tension in their relationship, as Daedalus found himself simultaneously encouraging his son's development while unconsciously holding back certain secrets of his craft. This internal conflict would prove to have profound consequences for both of them in the trials that lay ahead. Icarus absorbed his father's lessons with the eager enthusiasm of youth, but he also began to develop his own ideas about how things might be done differently. He questioned why certain traditional methods were considered unchangeable, and he proposed modifications that sometimes surprised even his experienced father. These moments of innovation filled Daedalus with both pride and anxiety, as he recognized his own restless spirit reflected in his son's suggestions. The peaceful years in Crete gradually gave way to complications that neither father nor son could have anticipated. King Minos, who had initially been a generous patron, began to grow possessive of Daedalus's talents. The king recognized that having such a skilled artisan in his service provided him with a significant advantage over rival kingdoms, and he became increasingly reluctant to allow Daedalus the freedom to travel or work for others. What began as generous patronage slowly transformed into something resembling captivity. Minos issued subtle restrictions on Daedalus's movements, suggesting that his services were too valuable to risk losing to competitors. The king's requests became more demanding, his expectations more exacting, and his tolerance for any delay or imperfection diminished with each passing season. The golden cage that Crete had initially represented began to feel more like a prison with every passing day. Daedalus found himself caught in a dilemma that tested both his pride and his judgment. His artistic integrity demanded that he maintain control over his work and his destiny, yet his practical circumstances made open rebellion against Minos extremely dangerous. The king controlled not only the resources that Daedalus needed for his work, but also the safety and well-being of Icarus, creating a situation where any attempt at escape would put his beloved son at risk. The final break between Daedalus and Minos came through a series of events that revealed the true extent of the king's ruthlessness and paranoia. When Theseus arrived in Crete as part of the tribute demanded from Athens, he brought with him a challenge that would expose the darker implications of Daedalus's greatest creation. The young Athenian prince was to be fed to the Minotaur, along with 13 other young people, in a ritual that had become a regular demonstration of Crete's dominance over the mainland. However, King Minos' daughter Ariadne fell in love with Theseus and sought a way to help him survive his encounter with the monster. She approached Daedalus, knowing that as the creator of the Labyrinth, he alone possessed the knowledge necessary to navigate its treacherous passages. The master craftsman found himself faced with a terrible choice between loyalty to his patron and his growing revulsion at the uses to which his creation was being put. The decision to help Ariadne was not made lightly. Daedalus understood that providing the means for Theseus to escape the labyrinth would constitute an act of betrayal that Minos would never forgive. Yet he also recognized that his masterpiece had become an instrument of cruelty rather than the artistic achievement he had intended. The thread that would guide Theseus safely through the maze became a symbol of Daedalus's own moral awakening, his recognition that technical brilliance without ethical consideration could lead to monstrous consequences. When Theseus successfully killed the Minotaur and escaped from Crete with Ariadne and the other Athenian captives, Minos' rage knew no bounds. The king immediately suspected Daedalus of complicity in the escape, and his suspicions were confirmed when investigations revealed the master craftsman's role in providing the means for Theseus's success. The punishment for such betrayal would be swift and severe, not only for Daedalus himself, but potentially for Icarus as well. Recognizing that their situation had become desperate, Daedalus knew that he and his son would need to escape from Crete immediately or face certain death at the hands of the enraged king. However, Minos had anticipated this possibility and had already taken steps to prevent their departure. All ships leaving Cretan ports were searched thoroughly, and guards were posted at every possible exit from the island. The king's control over sea routes made conventional escape impossible. Faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles, Daedalus retreated to his workshop to consider their options. The same innovative spirit that had made him legendary now turned towards solving the most important problem of his career: how to escape from an island when all conventional means of departure had been blocked. As he contemplated their predicament, his eyes turned upward toward the one realm that Minos could not control or monitor. The sky had always fascinated Daedalus, but now it represented more than aesthetic inspiration. Birds moved freely through the air, traveling vast distances without regard for human borders or restrictions. If he could somehow duplicate their ability to fly, he and Icarus might be able to escape Crete by a route that no earthly power could block. The concept was audacious beyond anything he had previously attempted, but desperate circumstances demanded desperate solutions. For weeks, Daedalus studied the flight of birds with scientific precision, observing how they used their wings to generate lift and thrust, how they controlled their direction and speed, and how they managed to stay aloft for extended periods. He dissected bird carcasses to understand the structure of their wings, examining the arrangement of feathers and the mechanics of the joints that controlled their movement. Every detail was carefully noted and analyzed as he began to formulate his plan. The construction of the wings required all of Daedalus's skill and ingenuity. He collected feathers of various sizes and types, studying their properties and determining how they could best be arranged to create the necessary aerodynamic surfaces. The largest feathers would form the primary flight surfaces, while smaller ones would provide fine control and stability. Each feather had to be positioned with mathematical precision to ensure that the finished wings would function as intended. The framework for the wings was crafted from lightweight wood, carefully shaped and joined to provide both strength and flexibility. Daedalus understood that the wings would need to withstand the stresses of flight while remaining light enough to be practical for human use. Every joint was reinforced, every connection tested to ensure that the structure would not fail at a critical moment during their escape attempt. The binding of the feathers to the wooden framework represented perhaps the most delicate aspect of the entire construction process. Daedalus experimented with various adhesives and attachment methods, ultimately settling on a combination of wax and thread that would provide the necessary flexibility while maintaining structural integrity. The wax, carefully heated to the perfect temperature, allowed him to secure each feather in its precise position while preserving the natural curve and texture that made bird flight possible. As he worked, Daedalus explained each step of the process to Icarus, who watched with growing excitement and wonder. The young man had never seen his father attempt anything quite so ambitious, and the prospect of actually flying filled him with an enthusiasm that bordered on intoxication. Where Daedalus approached the project with the careful, methodical precision of an experienced craftsman, Icarus saw only the thrilling possibility of soaring through the clouds like the gods themselves. The construction took many weeks of painstaking labor, with father and son working together in the secrecy of their workshop. Every day brought new challenges and refinements as Daedalus discovered aspects of wing design that required adjustment or improvement. The angle of the feathers, The distribution of weight, the flexibility of the joints, all had to be calibrated with mathematical precision to achieve the delicate balance necessary for sustained flight. During this period, Icarus began to develop his own understanding of the principles involved in their escape plan. He helped gather materials, assisted with the more routine aspects of construction, and gradually learned to appreciate the complexity of what his father was attempting to achieve. Yet beneath his growing comprehension lay an undercurrent of impatience, a youthful eagerness to test their creation that sometimes conflicted with his father's more cautious approach. The first pair of wings, designed for Daedalus himself, was completed after countless hours of meticulous work. The finished product was a marvel of engineering and artistry, resembling natural bird wings, while incorporating the modifications necessary to accommodate human anatomy. When fully extended, the wings spanned nearly twice the width of a man's outstretched arms, their surface covered with hundreds of carefully arranged feathers that caught the light with an almost ethereal beauty. Testing the wings presented challenges that required both courage and careful calculation. Daedalus began with short flights from elevated positions within his workshop, gradually increasing the height and duration as he learned to control his artificial appendages. The sensation of flight was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a combination of terror and exhilaration that tested every aspect of his physical and mental capabilities. The mechanics of human flight proved more complex than even Daedalus had anticipated. Unlike birds, which possessed the instinctive knowledge necessary for aerial navigation, he had to consciously learn every aspect of wing control, balance adjustment, and directional change. Each flight taught him something new about the principles involved, leading to constant refinements and modifications to improve both safety and efficiency. As his confidence grew, Daedalus began construction of the second pair of wings for Icarus. These required different proportions and weight distribution to accommodate his son's lighter build and different center of gravity. The young man's excitement grew with each passing day as he watched his own means of escape taking shape under his father's skilled hands. The completion of both pairs of wings marked a crucial milestone in their escape preparations, but Daedalus understood that successful flight would require more than just functional equipment. The psychological preparation was equally important, as the fear and disorientation of aerial travel could easily lead to panic and disaster. He spent considerable time teaching Icarus the basic principles of flight control, emphasizing the importance of smooth, measured movements and the dangers of sudden or erratic actions. Their practice sessions took place in the early hours before dawn, when the risk of discovery was minimal and the air currents were most predictable. Icarus proved to be a quick learner, his youthful agility and fearlessness serving him well in mentoring the basic techniques. However, his enthusiasm sometimes led him to attempt maneuvers that exceeded his skill level, requiring gentle correction from his more experienced father. The relationship between father and son deepened during these preparation sessions as they shared the unique experience of learning to fly together. Daedalus found himself simultaneously proud of his son's progress and concerned about his tendency toward recklessness. The memory of what had happened with Talos served as a constant reminder of how quickly confidence could turn into dangerous overreach. As their departure date approached, Daedalus spent increasing time studying weather patterns and wind currents around Crete. The success of their escape would depend not only on their ability to fly, but also on choosing the optimal conditions for their journey. Too much wind could make control difficult or impossible, while too little might prevent them from achieving the lift necessary for sustained flight over long distances. The route they would follow required careful planning and consideration of multiple factors. The shortest path to the mainland would take them directly across open water, but this presented the greatest risk if something went wrong during flight. Alternative routes that hugged the coastline or followed chains of smaller islands would provide more opportunities for emergency landing, but would also increase their exposure to potential pursuit by Minos's forces. Food and water presented additional logistical challenges, as the wings would not permit them to carry significant weight without compromising their flight capabilities. They would need to travel light and plan for the possibility of making emergency stops to rest and replenish their supplies. Every item they carried had to be essential for survival while remaining as lightweight as possible. The psychological pressure of their situation intensified as rumors began to circulate about Minos's increasing suspicion and anger. Guards appeared more frequently in their area, and questions were asked about their recent activities and whereabouts. The window of opportunity for their escape was clearly narrowing, forcing them to accelerate their timeline despite the risks involved in departing before they felt completely prepared. On the night before their planned departure, Daedalus conducted a final inspection of both pairs of wings, checking every joint, every feather, every connection that would determine whether they lived or died during their escape attempt. The wax that held everything together appeared stable, but he knew that exposure to heat or excessive stress could cause it to soften or fail entirely. This vulnerability would require constant vigilance during their flight. Sleep came fitfully that final night, as both father and son wrestled with anticipation and anxiety about what lay ahead. Daedalus found himself reviewing every aspect of their plan, searching for overlooked details or potential problems that could jeopardize their success. Icarus, meanwhile, struggled to contain his excitement about the adventure that awaited them. His imagination filled with visions of soaring high above the Mediterranean like the legendary heroes of ancient tales. The pre-dawn hours brought a mixture of nervousness and determination as they made their final preparations. The wings were carefully fitted and adjusted to ensure perfect balance and control response. Personal belongings were reduced to the absolute minimum necessary for survival, with each item evaluated multiple times before being deemed essential enough to include in their limited carrying capacity. As the first hints of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, Daedalus delivered to his son the instructions that would prove to be among the most important words ever spoken between father and child. These were not merely technical guidelines for successful flight, but wisdom born from a lifetime of experience with the dangers of unchecked ambition and the tragic consequences that could result from pushing beyond safe limits. The warnings Daedalus gave to Icarus reflected his deep understanding of both the technical and psychological challenges they would face during their escape. Flying too low would expose them to the spray and moisture of the ocean waves, which could damage their wings and make continued flight impossible. The salt water would add weight to their feathers while reducing the effectiveness of the wax that held their artificial wings together. Equally dangerous was the temptation to fly too high, where the heat of the sun could soften the wax beyond its ability to maintain structural integrity. The higher altitudes also presented challenges in terms of air pressure and temperature that could affect both their physical condition and to control their flight path effectively. The optimal altitude would require constant attention and adjustment throughout their journey. The emotional weight of these final instructions was not lost on either father or son. Daedalus spoke with the gravity of someone who understood the life and death implications of every word, while Icarus listened with the solemnity appropriate to such a momentous occasion. Yet beneath the young man's serious demeanor lay an undercurrent of excitement that no amount of paternal warning could completely suppress. As they stood together on the cliff from which they would launch their escape attempt, both men understood that they were about to embark on a journey that would test everything they had learned about flight, courage, and the delicate balance between ambition and wisdom. The wings that Daedalus had created represented the pinnacle of human ingenuity, but their success would ultimately depend on the judgment and restraint of those who wore them. The moment of departure arrived with the suddenness that characterizes all irreversible decisions. One instant they stood safely on solid ground, contemplating the magnitude of what they were about to attempt, and the next they had committed themselves to the air, trusting their lives to artificial wings and the accumulated wisdom of weeks of preparation and practice. The initial sensation of flight brought with it a rush of emotions that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. The ground fell away beneath them with terrifying speed, while the vast expanse of sky opened up in all directions with possibilities both thrilling and terrifying. For Daedalus, the moment represented the culmination of his greatest creative achievement, while for Icarus, it marked the beginning of the most exciting adventure of his young life. The first few minutes of their flight passed in a careful rhythm of wing beats and nervous adjustments, as both father and son concentrated on maintaining the steady, controlled movements that would carry them safely away from Crete. The early morning air was cool and stable, providing ideal conditions for their inaugural journey into the realm that had previously belonged only to birds and gods. Daedalus kept a watchful eye on his son, noting with satisfaction how well Icarus had absorbed the lessons of their practice sessions. Below them, the coastline of Crete gradually receded, its familiar landmarks growing smaller with each passing moment. The palace where they had lived and worked for so many years became nothing more than a distant speck of white marble against the darker landscape, while the harbors that Minos controlled so jealously appeared as tiny crescents carved into the shore. For the first time since their arrival on the island, they were truly free from the king's authority, soaring through air that recognized no earthly sovereignty. The sensation of flight continued to amaze and humble Daedalus, even as his analytical mind cataloged every aspect of their performance and condition. The wings responded to subtle shifts in body position and muscle tension, translating human intention into aerial movement with a precision that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Each feather seemed to contribute its part to the complex symphony of forces that kept them aloft, working in harmony to transform the dream of human flight into magnificent reality. Icarus flew with the natural grace of youth, his movements fluid and confident as he adapted to the three-dimensional freedom that surrounded them. His father watched with growing pride as the young man demonstrated an intuitive understanding of flight dynamics, making small corrections and adjustments that showed he truly comprehended the principles they had studied together. The boy's enthusiasm was evident in every wing beat, every gentle turn, every moment of pure joy that crossed his face as he experienced the miracle they had created. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly before them, its surface catching the early morning light in patterns that shifted and danced with each wave. From their elevated perspective, the sea appeared both beautiful and treacherous, offering no landmarks or reference points beyond the distant islands that dotted the horizon like scattered jewels. Navigation would require constant attention to their direction and speed, as well as careful management of their energy reserves to ensure they could reach their destination before exhaustion set in. As they continued their journey, Daedalus found himself reflecting on the path that had brought them to this extraordinary moment. The years of exile, the bitter lessons learned through jealousy and betrayal, the patient accumulation of knowledge and skill that had made their escape possible, all seemed to converge in these precious hours of freedom. Perhaps this was redemption of a sort, a chance to use his gifts for preservation rather than destruction, for love rather than ambition. The relationship between father and son had never been stronger than during these shared moments of flight. They moved through the air in loose formation, sometimes drawing closer together for comfort and companionship, other times spreading apart to explore the full range of their newfound capabilities. Their communication was largely nonverbal, consisting of gestures and expressions that conveyed encouragement, caution, or simple shared wonder at the magnificence of their achievement. Time seemed to flow differently in the air, marked not by the familiar rhythms of earthbound life, but by the steady cadence of wing beats and the gradual progression of the sun across the sky. What had begun as a desperate escape was transforming into something approaching a celebration, as both men began to appreciate the full implications of what they had accomplished. They had broken free not only from Minos's captivity, but from the limitations that had constrained human movement since the beginning of time. The physical demands of sustained flight gradually made themselves known through the growing fatigue in their arms and shoulders. The muscles required for wing control were different from those used in ordinary activities, and the constant tension necessary to maintain their altitude began to accumulate as the morning progressed. Daedalus monitored both his own condition and that of his son, knowing that exhaustion could lead to the kind of poor judgment that might prove fatal in their current circumstances. Icarus, however, seemed to draw energy from the experience itself, his youthful vigor sustaining him even as the miles passed beneath their wings. If anything, he appeared to be growing more confident and adventurous as the flight continued, occasionally experimenting with maneuvers that pushed slightly beyond the conservative techniques his father had taught him. These moments of innovation both impressed and concerned Daedalus, who recognized in them echoes of his own restless pursuit of new possibilities. The sun climbed steadily higher as they flew, its warmth increasingly noticeable on their exposed skin and artificial wings. Daedalus felt the first stirrings of concern about the wax that held their feathers in place, knowing that excessive heat could compromise the structural integrity they depended upon for survival. The balance between altitude and temperature would require constant attention as the day progressed and the sun reached its full strength. Below them, the water had taken on the deeper blue of the open Mediterranean, confirming that they had left the immediate vicinity of Crete far behind. Small fishing vessels appeared occasionally as tiny dots on the surface, their occupants undoubtedly unaware of the miraculous sight passing overhead. The perspective from above revealed the true vastness of the sea, stretching beyond the horizon in all directions with a grandeur that could only be appreciated from their elevated vantage point. Islands began to appear in the distance, their mountainous profiles rising from the sea like the backs of sleeping giants. These would serve as navigation markers and potential resting places if circumstances required an emergency landing. Daedalus identified each one as they passed, consulting the mental map he had studied so carefully during their preparation. The route to safety was long, but clearly marked by these natural waypoints. The steady rhythm of flight had a hypnotic quality that required conscious effort to resist. Daedalus found his mind occasionally wandering to thoughts of their future life on the mainland, the workshops they might establish, and the creations they might produce together as free men. These pleasant reveries had to be balanced against the need for constant vigilance regarding their immediate situation and the many factors that could still threaten their success. Icarus flew with increasing confidence, his movements becoming more fluid and natural as his body adapted to the requirements of aerial travel. The young man's face showed pure happiness, an expression of joy so complete that it seemed to illuminate the air around him. For someone who had grown up in captivity, however comfortable that captivity might have been, the experience of unlimited freedom was intoxicating in ways that his father could only partially understand. The technical aspects of their flight continued to fascinate Daedalus, even as he monitored them for signs of potential problems. The way the wings caught and redirected air currents, the subtle adjustments needed to maintain course and altitude, the delicate balance between forward momentum and lift, all demonstrated principles that he had studied but never fully appreciated until experiencing them firsthand. Each moment brought new insights into the mechanics of flight that could inform future improvements to their design. As the morning progressed toward midday, the sun's intensity began to create thermal currents that affected their flight characteristics. These invisible columns of rising warm air could provide additional lift when properly utilized, but they could also create turbulence that made control more difficult. Daedalus taught his son to recognize the signs of these thermal conditions and adjust their flight path accordingly, turning potential obstacles into advantages through knowledge and skill. The wax that bound their feathers began to show subtle changes as the temperature rose, becoming more pliable and responsive to stress. This increased flexibility actually improved their wing performance in some respects, allowing for more natural movement and better adaptation to changing air conditions. However, Daedalus knew that there was a critical threshold beyond which the wax would lose its structural integrity entirely, transforming their means of salvation into a death trap. Communication between father and son evolved throughout their journey, developing into a sophisticated system of gestures and expressions that allowed them to share information about wind conditions, fatigue levels, and navigation decisions. This nonverbal dialogue strengthened their bond while ensuring that both remained aware of their mutual situation and needs. The shared challenge of flight created an intimacy between them that transcended their normal father-son relationship. The Mediterranean islands continued to pass beneath them like stepping stones across an infinite blue expanse. Some were large enough to support substantial populations and showed evidence of agriculture and settlement, while others appeared to be nothing more than rocky outcroppings that provided homes for seabirds and little else. Each island represented both a potential refuge and a reminder of how far they still had to travel to reach their ultimate destination. Icarus began to show signs of growing boldness as his confidence in their artificial wings increased. The young man started to experiment with higher altitudes and more aggressive maneuvers, pushing the boundaries of what they had practiced during their preparation sessions. His natural athleticism and fearless attitude served him well in adapting to the demands of flight, but they also led him to take risks that made his father increasingly nervous. The beauty of their aerial perspective was undeniable, offering views of the world that no human had ever before experienced. Clouds appeared at eye level rather than as distant objects overhead, their forms and movements revealing patterns and structures invisible from the ground. The curvature of the earth became apparent at the horizon, while the play of light and shadow across the water created an ever-changing canvas of natural artistry that took their breath away. Navigation required constant attention to multiple factors, including wind direction, their own ground speed, and the position of the sun relative to their intended course. Daedalus had studied these elements carefully during their preparation, but the reality of flight introduced variables that could only be learned through experience. Small adjustments to their heading became necessary as crosswinds and air currents pushed them gradually off their planned route. The physical sensation of flight produced an almost addictive quality of freedom and power that was difficult to resist. Both men found themselves caught up in the pure joy of movement through three-dimensional space, the ability to rise and fall, turn and dive, accelerate and glide according to their own will and skill. This intoxicating sense of liberation from earthly constraints was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of their journey, as it encouraged exactly the kind of reckless behavior that their father had warned against. As the sun approached its zenith, the heat began to create noticeable effects on their wing structure. The wax softened perceptibly, requiring more frequent adjustments to maintain optimal feather alignment. Daedalus monitored these changes carefully, knowing that they represented the first signs of the thermal stress that could eventually destroy their means of flight. The balance between altitude and safety was becoming increasingly critical with each passing hour. Icarus seemed oblivious to these growing concerns, his attention focused entirely on the exhilarating experience of soaring through the sky like the legendary heroes of ancient myths. The young man's enthusiasm was infectious, reminding his father of the pure joy that could be found in pushing the boundaries of human capability. Yet beneath this admiration lay a growing anxiety about his son's tendency to test limits that were perhaps better left unexplored. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the water as they continued their journey toward the mainland. The heat had become a constant presence, affecting not only their physical comfort, but also the integrity of their artificial wings. Each degree of temperature increase brought them closer to the critical threshold beyond which their escape route could become their destruction. Their flight had lasted for hours, carrying them far from the captivity they had known in Crete toward the freedom that awaited on the distant mainland. The success of their escape seemed assured, their destination drawing steadily closer with each wing beat. Yet the very elements that had enabled their flight were beginning to work against them, creating new dangers that would test not only their technical skills, but also their wisdom and restraint. The stage was set for the final act of their aerial drama, as the accumulated heat of the Mediterranean sun and the growing confidence of youth combined to create conditions that would transform triumph into tragedy. The wings that had carried them so far from captivity would soon become the instruments of a lesson about the delicate balance between ambition and prudence, between the desire to soar and the wisdom to know when soaring becomes dangerous. The warmth of the Mediterranean sun had become more than a gentle companion during their flight. What had begun as a pleasant sensation against their skin was gradually transforming into something more intense, more demanding of their attention. Daedalus felt the change in the air around them, the way it seemed to shimmer with increasing heat as the day reached its peak. The master craftsman's experienced eye could detect subtle alterations in how their wings caught and held the air currents, small changes that spoke of the wax beginning to respond to temperatures that approached the limits of its structural reliability. Below them, the endless expanse of the Mediterranean continued to unfold in patterns of light and shadow that painted the surface in ever-changing hues of blue and gold. Schools of fish created dark patches that moved like living clouds beneath the waves, while the occasional dolphin broke the surface in graceful arcs that reminded both father and son of their own aerial dance through the sky above. The beauty of their perspective remained breathtaking, yet Daedalus found his attention increasingly divided between appreciation of the magnificent view and concern for the technical challenges that lay ahead. Icarus had grown remarkably comfortable with the mechanics of flight, his initial uncertainty replaced by a fluid confidence that spoke of natural aptitude and fearless determination. The young man's movements had evolved from the careful, measured wing beats his father had taught him into something more expressive, more personal. He had begun to develop his own style of aerial navigation, incorporating subtle variations that reflected his personality and growing understanding of how to work with the air currents rather than simply fighting against them. The relationship between the two flyers had deepened throughout their journey, their shared experience creating bonds that went far beyond the normal connections between father and son. They communicated through glances and gestures, each understanding the other's needs and concerns without the necessity of spoken words. When one showed signs of fatigue, the other would adjust their formation to provide encouragement and support. When air currents became challenging, they worked together to find the most efficient path through the turbulence. Yet within this harmony, subtle tensions were beginning to emerge. Icarus's growing confidence was leading him to experiment with maneuvers that pushed beyond the conservative approach his father had advocated. The young man would suddenly climb higher to test the limits of their altitude capabilities, or dive lower to experience the different air conditions closer to the water's surface. Each of these experiments lasted only moments before he returned to proper formation, but they represented a pattern of behavior that caused his father increasing concern. The sun's position in the sky marked their progress through the day with celestial precision. What had begun as an early morning escape had evolved into a midday odyssey that tested both their physical endurance and their equipment's durability. The heat that radiated down from above was matched by thermal reflections rising from the water below, creating an envelope of warmth that surrounded them completely. This thermal environment affected every aspect of their flight, from the density of the air that supported them to the flexibility of the materials that held their wings together. Daedalus found himself constantly evaluating the condition of their artificial wings, watching for signs that the wax was approaching its tolerance limits. The substance that had seemed so solid and reliable during construction was revealing its temperature sensitivity under the sustained exposure to Mediterranean heat. Individual feathers occasionally required adjustment as the binding material softened, though not yet to the point where structural integrity was compromised. These minor maintenance needs served as early warnings of more serious challenges that might lie ahead. The technical aspects of sustained flight continued to reveal new complexities that their ground-based testing had not fully prepared them for. The constant muscular effort required to maintain wing control created fatigue patterns that built up gradually over hours of flying. The mental concentration necessary for navigation and altitude control demanded sustained focus that was difficult to maintain as the journey stretched on. Most challenging of all was the need to constantly balance multiple competing factors: speed versus endurance, altitude versus temperature, direct routes versus safe ones. Icarus seemed to thrive on these challenges, his youthful energy and enthusiasm carrying him through difficulties that might have overwhelmed someone with less natural resilience. The young man's face showed pure exhilaration as he mastered each new aspect of aerial travel, his confidence growing with every successful maneuver. Where his father saw potential problems and necessary precautions, Icarus saw opportunities for exploration and achievement. This fundamental difference in perspective was beginning to create a subtle but significant divergence in their approaches to the flight. The islands that dotted their route had become familiar landmarks, each one marking their progress toward the distant mainland that represented safety and freedom. Some of these islands showed clear signs of human habitation, with settlements visible along their shores and ships moving between their harbors. Others appeared completely wild, their rocky coasts and mountainous interiors suggesting places where few humans had ever set foot. All of them served as reminders of the solid ground that lay far below their aerial path, ground that represented both potential refuge and the ultimate destination of anyone whose wings might fail. Air currents in the afternoon heat had become more complex and unpredictable, creating pockets of turbulence that required skilled navigation to avoid or manage. These thermal disturbances were strongest over land masses and near the interface between water and shore, where temperature differences created rising columns of heated air. Daedalus had learned to read the signs of these conditions and adjust their course accordingly, but the increasing frequency and intensity of such disturbances made flying more demanding with each passing hour. The wax that held their feathers in precise alignment was showing more pronounced effects from the sustained heat exposure. While still maintaining its essential function, the material had become noticeably more pliable, responding to stress and pressure in ways that required constant attention and adjustment. Feathers that had remained perfectly positioned during the cooler morning hours now required periodic realignment, as the softened wax allowed them to shift under the aerodynamic forces of flight. Icarus had begun to notice these changes as well, though his interpretation of their significance differed markedly from his father's cautious assessment. Where Daedalus saw warning signs that demanded increased vigilance and potentially conservative adjustments to their flight plan, Icarus saw evidence that their wings were becoming more flexible and responsive. The young man began to experiment with how these changed characteristics might allow for new types of maneuvers or improved performance under certain conditions. The beauty of their aerial journey continued to unfold in ways that neither father nor son had fully anticipated. Clouds that had appeared solid and opaque from ground level revealed themselves to be intricate structures of water vapor and air currents when viewed from their unique perspective. The play of sunlight through these formations created constantly shifting patterns of illumination that transformed the seascape below into an ever-changing work of art. Birds that shared their airspace provided lessons in flight technique and demonstrations of how natural wings adapted to changing conditions. Navigation had evolved from a simple matter of following predetermined courses to a complex dance of adjustments and corrections based on real-time conditions. Wind patterns shifted throughout the day, requiring constant attention to maintain their intended heading. The sun's position provided essential directional reference, but thermal effects from its heating created air conditions that sometimes made direct routes less efficient than longer paths that avoided areas of excessive turbulence or temperature. The psychological effects of sustained flight were as significant as the physical challenges. The constant awareness of being suspended high above the unforgiving surface of the sea created a background tension that required mental discipline to manage effectively. This stress was balanced by the exhilarating sense of freedom and accomplishment that came from mastering a completely new form of human movement. The combination created an emotional intensity that was both exhausting and addictive. Daedalus found himself reflecting on the broader implications of what they had achieved during their escape. The successful development of human flight represented a breakthrough that could transform how people understood the boundaries of possibility. Yet the very success of their venture was revealing new challenges and responsibilities that came with such capabilities. The knowledge they carried could benefit humanity enormously, but it could also lead to disasters if not properly understood and controlled. Communication between father and son had evolved into an intricate system of signals and responses that allowed them to coordinate their movements and share information about changing conditions. A subtle shift in wing position could indicate fatigue, while changes in formation communicated decisions about course corrections or altitude adjustments. This nonverbal dialogue had become so sophisticated that they could conduct complex discussions about navigation and tactics without ever speaking a word. The heat continued to intensify as the sun reached its highest point in the sky, creating conditions that tested every aspect of their flight capabilities. The wax that bound their wings had now softened to the point where it required almost constant attention to maintain proper feather alignment. Individual feathers occasionally came loose entirely, drifting away on the wind as evidence of the increasing structural stress their artificial wings were experiencing. Icarus had begun to show signs of what could only be described as aerial intoxication. The young man's movements had become more fluid and expressive, incorporating elements that went beyond mere transportation to approach something resembling artistic expression. He would execute graceful spirals that had no navigational purpose other than the pure joy of movement through three-dimensional space. His climbs and descents followed patterns that emphasized beauty over efficiency, creating aerial choreography that was magnificent to observe but concerning in its implications. The master craftsman recognized in his son's behavior the same intoxicating effects that he had observed in himself during the early stages of their practice sessions. The ability to fly produced psychological changes that went beyond simple excitement or satisfaction. There was something about moving through the air under one's own power that seemed to affect fundamental aspects of human nature, creating feelings of invincibility and godlike capability that could easily overwhelm rational judgment. These observations led Daedalus to increase his vigilance regarding both their technical situation and his son's emotional state. The combination of equipment stress from thermal effects and psychological pressure from the intoxicating nature of flight created conditions that demanded the highest levels of caution and restraint. Yet these were precisely the qualities that became most difficult to maintain as the euphoria of successful flight continued to build throughout their journey. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface reflecting the intense sunlight in patterns that created almost blinding brilliance at certain angles. Navigation required constant adjustment to account for visual distortions caused by the interaction of light and water, while the heat rising from the sun-warmed surface created additional thermal currents that affected their flight characteristics. Every aspect of their environment seemed to be intensifying as the day progressed toward its thermal peak. Islands continued to mark their progress, but the landmarks were becoming more sparse as they moved into the deeper waters that separated Crete from the mainland. The gaps between potential landing sites grew longer, increasing the importance of maintaining their wings in optimal condition while reducing their options if emergency situations should develop. This combination of factors created a risk profile that was gradually shifting from manageable to potentially dangerous. The technical challenges of their flight were compounded by the increasing difficulty of maintaining formation and communication as thermal turbulence made smooth flying more difficult to achieve. Air pockets and sudden wind shifts required quick reflexes and constant attention, leaving less mental capacity available for monitoring equipment condition or assessing their overall situation. The demands of simply staying aloft were beginning to overwhelm other considerations that were equally important for their long-term success. Icarus seemed to interpret these challenging conditions as opportunities to demonstrate his growing mastery of flight techniques, rather than adopting the more conservative approach that circumstances seemed to warrant. The young man began to push even harder against the boundaries of what their equipment could safely handle. His maneuvers became more aggressive, his altitude changes more dramatic, and his overall approach to flying more experimental and less disciplined. The father's attempts to communicate caution and restraint through their established system of gestures and expressions met with responses that suggested his son was becoming less receptive to guidance or correction. Icarus would acknowledge his father's signals with brief nods or wing adjustments, but then quickly return to the adventurous flying style that was causing increasing concern. The young man's confidence had evolved into something approaching defiance of the limitations that his father continued to emphasize. Weather conditions continued to evolve as the afternoon progressed, with thermal activity reaching levels that made flying increasingly challenging for equipment that was already showing signs of stress from sustained heat exposure. The wax binding their feathers had softened to the point where major structural failure was becoming a realistic possibility rather than just a theoretical concern. Individual feathers were being lost with increasing frequency, creating gaps in their wing surfaces that affected both lift and control characteristics. The sun had become an adversary as much as a navigation aid, its intense heat creating conditions that threatened the very materials that made their flight possible. The temperature had risen beyond anything they had experienced during their preparation and testing, revealing weaknesses in their design that had been impossible to anticipate under less extreme conditions. Every moment of continued flight was pushing them deeper into uncharted territory where the risks were unknown and potentially catastrophic. Navigation became increasingly difficult as thermal distortions affected visibility and air currents created unpredictable changes in their ground track. The direct route to their destination was no longer the most practical option, as areas of excessive thermal activity forced them to seek paths that avoided the most dangerous conditions. These detours added distance and time to their journey, increasing the total exposure to conditions that were already testing their equipment beyond its design limits. The psychological pressure of their situation was beginning to affect both father and son in different ways. Daedalus found himself torn between the need for increased caution and the recognition that they were committed to completing their journey regardless of the risks involved. Turning back was no longer an option, as they had passed the point where they could safely return to Crete with their remaining fuel reserves. They had to continue forward, despite conditions that were becoming increasingly hazardous. Icarus, meanwhile, seemed to be experiencing the opposite reaction to the mounting challenges. Rather than becoming more cautious as risks increased, the young man appeared to be energized by the danger and complexity of their situation. His flying became even more adventurous and experimental, as if the approaching limits of their equipment's capabilities represented challenges to be conquered rather than warnings to be heeded. The master craftsman began to realize that his greatest creation might also become the instrument of his greatest tragedy. The wings that had provided their escape from captivity were revealing themselves to be far more temperamental and dangerous than he had fully appreciated during their development. The margin of safety that had seemed adequate under ideal conditions was proving insufficient under the extreme conditions they were now encountering. The heat continued its relentless assault on their artificial wings, softening the wax to the point where structural integrity was maintained only through constant vigilance and frequent adjustments. Feathers required realignment every few minutes, and the overall wing shape was gradually changing as the binding material lost its ability to maintain precise positioning. These changes affected flight characteristics in ways that demanded continuous adaptation of technique and strategy. Communication between father and son became increasingly difficult as the demands of flight management consumed more of their attention and energy. The sophisticated system of nonverbal signals they had developed worked well under stable conditions, but proved inadequate for conveying complex messages about equipment status and safety concerns. Daedalus found himself unable to effectively communicate the full extent of his growing alarm about their situation. The afternoon sun had reached its peak intensity, creating thermal conditions that exceeded anything in their previous experience. The wax that held their wings together was now soft enough that it could be deformed by moderate pressure, making structural failure not just possible, but increasingly likely with each passing moment. The question was no longer whether their equipment would fail, but when and how catastrophically that failure might occur. Icarus continued to fly with the confidence and enthusiasm of someone who had not yet fully grasped the precarious nature of their situation. The young man's natural talent for flight and his fearless approach to new challenges had served him well throughout their journey, but these same qualities were now leading him toward behaviors that could prove fatal under their current circumstances. The beauty of their aerial perspective remained undimmed by the mounting technical challenges, providing a constant reminder of what they had achieved and what they stood to lose. The Mediterranean spread below them in all its ancient magnificence, while the sky above offered the infinite freedom that had made their desperate escape attempt worthwhile despite all risks and difficulties. The stage was set for the climactic moments of their journey, as the accumulated effects of heat and stress approached the critical thresholds that would determine whether their escape ended in triumph or tragedy. The delicate balance between human ambition and natural law was about to be tested in ways that would transform their story from a tale of successful innovation into a timeless lesson about the dangers of flying too close to the sun. Too close to the sun. The Mediterranean afternoon had transformed from their gentle morning companion into something far more demanding and treacherous. The air itself seemed to pulse with heat waves that rose from the sun-warmed waters below, creating invisible columns of thermal activity that buffeted their wings and tested their control with every passing moment. What had begun as a pleasant warmth against their skin now felt like the breath of some great furnace, penetrating through their clothing and affecting every aspect of their flight dynamics. Daedalus could feel the subtle but unmistakable changes in how his wings responded to the increasingly challenging conditions. The feathers that had maintained their perfect alignment throughout the cooler morning hours were now shifting and adjusting constantly as the wax that bound them grew softer with each degree of rising temperature. His experienced craftsman's eye could detect the gradual transformation of his masterpiece from a precisely engineered flight system into something more fluid and unpredictable. The master artisan's concern extended beyond mere technical considerations to encompass the broader implications of their situation. They had committed themselves to a course of action that offered no opportunity for retreat or reconsideration. The distance they had traveled made returning to Crete impossible, even if such a return would not mean certain death at the hands of King Minos. Their only option was to continue forward toward the mainland, despite conditions that were rapidly approaching the limits of what their equipment could safely handle. Icarus flew alongside his father with movements that had evolved far beyond the careful, measured techniques they had practiced during their preparation. The young man had developed an intuitive understanding of flight that seemed to transcend mere mechanical knowledge, incorporating elements of artistry and personal expression that transformed simple transportation into something approaching dance. His wings moved with fluid grace that spoke of natural talent and fearless experimentation with the possibilities that aerial freedom provided. The relationship between the two flyers had deepened throughout their journey in ways that neither had fully anticipated. Their shared experience of conquering the ancient human limitation of ground-bound existence created bonds that went beyond normal family connections. They had become partners in an endeavor that no father and son had ever undertaken before, explorers of a realm that had previously belonged only to birds and the imagination of poets and dreamers. Yet within this deepening connection, subtle tensions were beginning to emerge that reflected fundamental differences in how they approached the challenges and opportunities of flight. Daedalus, shaped by years of experience with the consequences of unchecked ambition, found himself increasingly focused on the technical limitations and safety considerations that governed their artificial wings. His awareness of how quickly triumph could transform into disaster made him hyper-vigilant about every sign of equipment stress or environmental challenge. Icarus, unburdened by such hard-won wisdom and energized by the pure exhilaration of aerial freedom, was developing an increasingly adventurous approach to their flight that pushed steadily against the conservative boundaries his father had established. The young man's natural athleticism and fearless spirit served him well in adapting to the demands of three-dimensional movement, but they also led him toward behaviors that made his father's pulse quicken with anxiety. The sun had reached its zenith in the cloudless Mediterranean sky, transforming from a benevolent guide into a source of increasingly dangerous thermal stress. The intensity of its radiation was affecting every material aspect of their flight system, from the wooden framework that provided structural support to the delicate wax compounds that held hundreds of individual feathers in their precise positions. Each moment of continued exposure pushed them deeper into unexplored territory where the margins of safety were unknown and potentially non-existent. Navigation had become a complex challenge that required constant attention to multiple competing factors. The direct route to their destination would expose them to the most intense thermal conditions, where rising columns of superheated air created turbulence that could easily overwhelm their ability to maintain controlled flight. Alternative paths that sought cooler air currents added distance and time to their journey, increasing their total exposure to conditions that were already testing their equipment beyond its design specifications. The physical demands of sustained flight were accumulating in ways that their practice sessions had not fully prepared them for. The muscles required for wing control were fatiguing according to patterns that developed over hours, rather than the minutes they had experienced during training. Mental concentration, necessary for navigation and equipment monitoring, demanded focus that became increasingly difficult to maintain as the combination of heat, fatigue, and sensory overload took its toll on their cognitive capabilities. Icarus seemed to draw energy from these mounting challenges rather than being diminished by them. The young man's enthusiasm for flight appeared to intensify as conditions became more demanding, as if the approaching limits of their capabilities represented opportunities for greater achievement rather than warnings to exercise increased caution. His maneuvers became more complex and ambitious, incorporating elements that went far beyond the practical requirements of transportation towards something that resembled artistic expression. The master craftsman found himself caught between admiration for his son's natural talent and growing alarm about the direction that talent was leading them. The same fearless spirit that made Icarus such a gifted flyer also made him resistant to the kind of conservative approach that their deteriorating circumstances seemed to demand. Every gesture of caution from his father was acknowledged briefly and then set aside in favor of continued experimentation with the boundaries of what their artificial wings could achieve. Communication between them had evolved throughout their journey into a sophisticated system of nonverbal signals that worked well under stable conditions but proved inadequate for conveying the complexity of Daedalus's growing concerns. The need to concentrate on the immediate demands of flight left little mental capacity available for the kind of detailed discussion that their situation required. Important information about equipment status and safety considerations had to be compressed into simple gestures that could not capture the full nuance of the technical challenges they faced. The wax that bound their wing systems had now softened to the point where it responded visibly to the aerodynamic stresses of flight. Individual feathers required constant adjustment to maintain proper alignment, while the overall wing shape gradually changed as the binding material lost its ability to hold precise configurations. These alterations affected lift characteristics and control response in ways that demanded continuous adaptation of flying technique and strategy. Below them, the Mediterranean continued its ancient dance of light and shadow, but the beauty of their perspective was increasingly overshadowed by practical concerns about their ability to complete their journey successfully. Schools of fish moved like living clouds beneath the surface, while dolphins occasionally broke into view with graceful arcs that reminded both flyers of their own passage through the three-dimensional realm above. The contrast between the natural ease of these marine creatures and their own increasingly precarious situation was not lost on either father or son. Islands that had served as navigation landmarks earlier in their flight were becoming more sparse as they moved into the deeper waters that separated Crete from the mainland. The gaps between potential emergency landing sites grew longer with each passing mile, increasing the importance of maintaining their equipment in optimal condition while simultaneously reducing their options should catastrophic failure occur. This combination created a risk profile that was shifting steadily from manageable to genuinely dangerous. Thermal activity continued to intensify as the afternoon sun reached its full power, creating air conditions that challenged every aspect of their flight capabilities. Columns of rising heated air produced turbulence that could lift them unexpectedly or drop them into pockets of disturbed atmosphere that tested their ability to maintain controlled flight. These thermal currents were strongest over land masses and near the boundaries between water and shore, forcing them to constantly adjust their course to avoid the most hazardous conditions. The psychological effects of their situation were manifesting differently in father and son, reflecting their distinct personalities and life experiences. Daedalus found himself increasingly torn between the need for greater caution and the recognition that they were committed to completing their journey regardless of mounting risks. His knowledge of how quickly engineering systems could fail under stress conditions created a background anxiety that competed with the exhilaration of successful flight for control of his emotional state. Icarus experienced the opposite reaction to their challenging circumstances. Rather than becoming more conservative as risks accumulated, the young man seemed energized by the complexity and danger of their situation. His flying style became even more expressive and experimental, as if the technical limitations of their equipment represented challenges to be conquered through skill and determination, rather than obstacles that demanded respect and careful management. The heat had become a constant, oppressive presence that affected every aspect of their flight experience. The air temperature had risen to levels that made breathing more difficult and created additional stress on their physical systems, already challenged by the demands of sustained muscular effort. Their clothing, designed for the cooler conditions of early morning flight, now felt uncomfortably warm and restrictive, adding to the overall burden of factors that competed for their attention and energy. Visibility had begun to suffer as thermal distortions created shimmering effects that made distant objects appear to wave and dance in ways that complicated navigation and distance estimation. The sun's reflection off the water surface created areas of blinding brilliance that forced them to adjust their flight path to avoid visual impairment that could lead to disorientation or collision with obstacles they failed to perceive in time. Equipment maintenance had evolved from occasional minor adjustments to a constant process of monitoring and correction that consumed increasing amounts of their attention and physical capability. Feathers that worked loose from their wax bindings had to be repositioned or discarded if they could not be secured properly. The overall wing shape required frequent adjustment to maintain optimal aerodynamic characteristics, as the softened binding material allowed gradual deformation under flight loads. The master craftsman began to realize that they were approaching conditions that exceeded the design parameters he had established during the development of their wing systems. The combination of thermal stress, sustained flight loads, and time-related fatigue was creating failure modes that he had not fully anticipated during their preparation phase. His engineering knowledge told him that they were entering a regime where catastrophic failure was not just possible, but increasingly probable with each passing moment of continued exposure. Navigation decisions became increasingly critical as their options for course correction diminished with distance from potential emergency landing sites. The most direct route to safety would expose them to the most severe thermal conditions, where equipment failure was most likely to occur. Longer routes that sought more favorable air conditions would extend their total flight time and increase their exposure to cumulative stress effects that could prove equally dangerous in different ways. Icarus continued to fly with the confidence and enthusiasm of someone who had not yet fully grasped the precarious nature of their evolving situation. The young man's natural talent for aerial movement and his fearless approach to new challenges had served him well throughout their escape. But these same qualities were now leading him toward behaviors that could prove catastrophic under their current circumstances. His increasingly aggressive flying style was placing additional stress on equipment that was already operating at the margins of its capabilities. The afternoon sun had transformed from a navigation aid into an active threat to their survival, its intense radiation creating conditions that attacked the fundamental materials upon which their flight depended. The wax compounds that held their artificial wings together were approaching the threshold temperatures where structural integrity could no longer be maintained, regardless of how carefully they managed other aspects of their flight profile. Communication attempts became increasingly desperate as Daedalus tried to convey the severity of their situation through their limited system of aerial signals. His gestures toward the sun and his own softening wing components were acknowledged by Icarus with brief nods, but the young man's subsequent behavior suggested that he either did not understand or chose not to accept the implications of what his father was trying to communicate. The beauty of their aerial perspective remained magnificent despite the mounting technical challenges, providing a constant reminder of what they had achieved and what they stood to lose. The ancient Mediterranean spread below them in patterns that had remained unchanged since the dawn of civilization, while the infinite sky above offered the kind of freedom that mortals had dreamed about since they first observed the flight of birds. Weather conditions continued to deteriorate as thermal activity reached peak intensity levels that exceeded anything in their previous experience. Air pockets and sudden wind shifts created flight hazards that demanded quick reflexes and perfect equipment response, qualities that were becoming increasingly difficult to achieve as their wing systems degraded under sustained thermal assault. The psychological pressure of their situation intensified as Daedalus realized that his greatest creation was simultaneously his most dangerous achievement. The wings that had enabled their escape from captivity were revealing themselves to be far more temperamental and fragile than he had understood during their development phase. The margin of safety that had seemed adequate under controlled testing conditions was proving wholly insufficient under the extreme operational environment they now faced. Time seemed to accelerate as critical thresholds approached with inexorable certainty. Every moment of continued flight pushed them deeper into unknown territory where the consequences of equipment failure would be immediate and final. The question was no longer whether their artificial wings would fail under the accumulated stress of heat and sustained operation, but when that failure would occur and whether it would happen gradually enough to allow for emergency procedures or catastrophically enough to eliminate any possibility of survival. The stage was set for the climactic moments that would transform their story of successful innovation and daring escape into a timeless tale about the delicate balance between human ambition and the immutable laws of nature. The sun that had guided their navigation was about to exact a price for their presumption in entering a realm that had been reserved for gods and birds since the beginning of time. The wax had become more than merely soft now, transforming into something that barely maintained its structural purpose as the Mediterranean sun reached its most punishing intensity. Individual droplets began to form along the edges of feathers, glistening like tears before being swept away by the rushing air. Daedalus watched with growing horror as his masterpiece slowly dissolved under conditions that no amount of preparation could have fully anticipated. Each wing beat now required conscious adjustment to compensate for the changing aerodynamic characteristics as feathers shifted out of alignment or detached entirely from their moorings. The precise engineering that had made their flight possible was being systematically undone by the very element that had enabled their navigation. The sun, which had served as their celestial compass throughout the morning, had become an adversary whose power threatened to destroy everything they had worked to achieve. Icarus flew with increasing boldness, his movements growing more fluid and expressive as he discovered new possibilities within their three-dimensional realm. The young man had begun to experiment with climbing to higher altitudes, drawn by the promise of cooler air and the intoxicating sense of approaching the domain of the gods themselves. His natural grace in the air had evolved into something approaching artistic mastery, each maneuver executed with the confidence of someone who had transcended ordinary human limitations. The father's attempts to signal caution were met with acknowledgement but little actual change in behavior. Icarus would respond to his father's gestures with brief adjustments to his flight path, only to resume his experimental approach once he felt the immediate concern had been addressed. The young man's interpretation of their situation differed fundamentally from his father's assessment, seeing opportunity where experience suggested danger. The heat created visual distortions that made accurate distance estimation increasingly difficult. Objects on the horizon seemed to shimmer and dance, while the boundary between sky and sea became blurred in the thermal haze that rose from the sun-warmed waters below. Navigation required constant correction as these optical illusions created false impressions about their position relative to landmarks and their progress toward their destination. Thermal currents had intensified to the point where maintaining stable flight required exceptional skill and constant attention. Columns of rising hot air would lift them unexpectedly, while sudden downdrafts threatened to drop them toward the unforgiving surface of the sea. These invisible forces created an aerial obstacle course that tested their abilities and equipment far beyond anything they had encountered during their preparation phase. The physical demands of compensating for these challenging conditions were accumulating in ways that threatened to overwhelm their endurance. The constant muscular adjustments required to maintain control in turbulent air created fatigue patterns that built steadily throughout the afternoon. Mental concentration, necessary for processing multiple, simultaneous challenges, left little cognitive capacity available for other considerations that might prove equally important for their survival. Individual feathers began to separate from their wing structures with increasing frequency, each loss creating small but cumulative changes in their flight characteristics. The gaps in their wing surfaces affected both lift generation and control authority, requiring continuous adaptation of technique to maintain effective flight performance. These material failures served as visible evidence of the systematic degradation occurring throughout their artificial wing systems. Icarus seemed to interpret these equipment changes as opportunities to explore new flight techniques rather than warnings about approaching system limits. The young man adapted to the altered characteristics of his wings with remarkable skill, modifying his flying style to accommodate the reduced effectiveness of his control surfaces. His ability to maintain graceful flight despite deteriorating equipment demonstrated natural talent that both impressed and alarmed his father. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly in all directions, its vast expanse offering no compromise or mercy for those who had overextended their capabilities. The beauty of the seascape remained magnificent, but its very grandeur served as a reminder of how small and vulnerable they were in comparison to the forces of nature that surrounded them. Every wave that caught the sunlight seemed to mock their presumption in attempting to cross such distances through artificial means. Distance to the mainland had become difficult to estimate accurately due to the thermal distortions that affected visibility and the gradual changes in their flight efficiency as equipment degraded. What should have been a straightforward navigation problem had evolved into a complex calculation involving multiple variables that were changing continuously. The margin for error was shrinking with each passing moment as their options for course correction diminished. Weather patterns continued to evolve in ways that increased the challenges they faced. The thermal activity that had been merely troublesome during the morning hours had intensified to levels that created genuine flight hazards. Air masses of different temperatures collided to create turbulence that could overwhelm their ability to maintain controlled flight, while the overall atmospheric instability made predicting conditions even a few minutes ahead virtually impossible. Communication between father and son had been reduced to its most essential elements as the demands of flight management consumed their available attention and energy. Complex ideas about risk assessment and tactical decisions had to be compressed into simple gestures that often failed to convey the full significance of rapidly changing circumstances. The sophisticated dialogue they had developed earlier in their journey was no longer adequate for the critical decisions they now faced. Daedalus found himself confronting the possibility that his greatest achievement might become the instrument of his greatest loss. The wings that had represented the pinnacle of human ingenuity were revealing vulnerabilities that could transform their triumph into tragedy. His knowledge of materials and engineering told him that they were approaching critical failure points, yet their situation offered no opportunity for the kind of careful analysis and systematic response that such problems typically required. The master craftsman's mind raced through potential solutions and emergency procedures, but every option seemed to involve risks that were as dangerous as their current circumstances. Attempting to reduce altitude would expose them to the thermal reflections and increased turbulence closer to the water surface. Maintaining their current altitude meant continued exposure to the intense solar radiation that was systematically destroying their equipment. Climbing higher might provide a temporary relief from thermal stress, but would place additional demands on wings that were already operating beyond their design limits. Icarus had begun to show signs of what could only be described as aerial euphoria, his movements becoming increasingly bold and expressive as he explored the full range of possibilities that flight offered. The young man executed spirals and climbs that served no practical purpose other than the pure joy of movement through three-dimensional space. His face showed an expression of complete happiness that seemed almost luminous in the afternoon sunlight. The contrast between his son's exuberant confidence and his own growing alarm created an emotional tension that added to the physical stresses Daedalus was already managing. Part of him wanted to share in Icarus's joy and wonder at what they had accomplished together. Another part recognized that this very enthusiasm was leading them toward behaviors that could prove fatal under their current circumstances. Solar radiation had intensified to levels that created almost unbearable heat against their exposed skin, while the reflected glare from the water below forced them to squint constantly to maintain visual reference points. The combination of direct and reflected thermal energy was attacking their wing systems from multiple directions, accelerating the degradation process beyond what simple time and temperature exposure alone would have produced. The wax binding their feathers had now reached a consistency that barely qualified as solid material. Individual components of their wing structure were being held in place more by aerodynamic forces and surface tension than by any meaningful mechanical connection. This precarious state of affairs could not continue indefinitely, as the slightest disruption or additional stress could trigger cascading failures that would destroy their ability to remain airborne. Navigation had become a desperate race against time, as Daedalus tried to identify the shortest possible route to any form of solid ground while simultaneously managing the immediate challenges of keeping them aloft under deteriorating conditions. Every island or coastal feature that appeared on the horizon represented potential salvation, but also served as a reminder of how far they still had to travel with equipment that was failing systematically. Icarus continued to fly with the fluid grace of someone who had achieved perfect harmony with the aerial environment, his movements flowing seamlessly from one maneuver to another in patterns that seemed to defy the mechanical limitations of their artificial wings. The young man had developed an intuitive understanding of flight dynamics that transcended mere technical knowledge, incorporating elements of artistry that transformed practical transportation into something approaching divine expression. The thermal environment had become hostile in ways that threatened not only their equipment, but their physical ability to continue functioning effectively. Dehydration and heat exhaustion were beginning to affect their judgment and reaction times, creating additional layers of risk that compounded the mechanical challenges they were already facing. The combination of physical stress and equipment degradation was approaching critical thresholds where human error could easily trigger catastrophic outcomes. Time seemed to compress as critical decision points approached with increasing frequency. Every moment required choices about altitude, heading, and flight technique that could determine whether they survived the next few minutes of their journey. The luxury of careful deliberation had been eliminated by circumstances that demanded immediate responses based on incomplete information and rapidly changing conditions. The psychological pressure of their situation was manifesting in ways that affected their ability to work together effectively as a team. Daedalus's growing anxiety about their equipment status made him increasingly focused on conservative flight techniques and risk avoidance measures. Icarus's euphoric response to the challenges they faced led him toward increasingly adventurous behaviors that pushed against every safety boundary his father tried to establish. Their artificial wings had become temporary structures, held together by forces that grew weaker with each passing moment. The engineering principles that had seemed so solid during the design and construction phase were proving inadequate under operational conditions that exceeded every assumption built into their original specifications. They were operating in a regime where theoretical knowledge provided little guidance for practical decisions. Weather conditions continued to deteriorate as the afternoon thermal cycle reached its peak intensity. The atmosphere around them had become actively hostile to controlled flight, with air currents that changed direction and velocity unpredictably, and thermal gradients that created invisible barriers and corridors that could trap or redirect their movement without warning. Every aspect of their environment was working against their attempts to maintain stable, controlled progress toward safety. The sun had become the dominant factor in their tactical calculations, its position and intensity determining everything from their optimal heading to their maximum safe altitude. What had begun as a navigation reference had evolved into an environmental hazard that threatened their survival through direct attack on the materials that made their flight possible. The very star that had guided ancient mariners across these same waters was now their most dangerous enemy. Visibility continued to degrade as thermal distortions created optical effects that made accurate distance and bearing estimation increasingly difficult. Landmarks that should have provided clear navigation references appeared to waver and shift in ways that confused their spatial orientation and made course corrections problematic. The reliable visual cues they had depended upon throughout their journey were being systematically compromised by atmospheric conditions. Communication had been reduced to its most primitive elements, as both father and son focused their remaining mental resources on the immediate demands of staying alive. The sophisticated system of aerial signals they had developed worked adequately for routine flight operations, but proved wholly inadequate for conveying the complexity of their current emergency situation. Critical information about equipment status and tactical decisions had to be compressed into gestures that captured only fragments of their full meaning. The Mediterranean had revealed itself to be far more challenging than either of them had anticipated when they began their escape attempt. What had appeared from the ground to be a simple matter of flying from one point to another had proven to involve complexities and hazards that no amount of theoretical preparation could have fully predicted. They were learning through direct experience that the realm of flight operated according to rules that were fundamentally different from those governing terrestrial existence. Material failures were now occurring with such frequency that maintaining effective wing function required constant attention and adjustment. Feathers detached from their moorings faster than they could be replaced or repositioned, while the overall structural integrity of their wing systems degraded in ways that affected every aspect of their flight performance. They were approaching the point where their artificial wings would no longer provide adequate lift to keep them airborne. The heat had transformed their escape route into a furnace that tested every component of their flight systems beyond its design limits. The wax that had seemed so stable and reliable during construction was now flowing like liquid, carrying away the carefully positioned feathers that provided their lift and control authority. Each moment of continued exposure to these thermal conditions brought them closer to complete system failure. Icarus had begun to climb toward higher altitudes with increasing determination, drawn by some combination of tactical logic and emotional compulsion that made him resistant to his father's signals of caution and concern. The young man seemed to believe that gaining altitude would provide relief from the thermal stress that was destroying their equipment, not recognizing that the very act of climbing was placing additional demands on wings that were already failing systematically. The master craftsman watched with growing horror as his son rose higher into the intense sunlight. Each foot of altitude gained, bringing him closer to thermal conditions that would complete the destruction of his artificial wings. The same fearless spirit that had made Icarus such a gifted flyer was now leading him directly toward the one environmental condition that their equipment could not survive. Daedalus tried desperately to signal his son to descend, using every gesture and expression in their aerial vocabulary to communicate the urgent need for immediate altitude reduction. His signals were acknowledged with brief waves and nods, but Icarus continued his climb with the determination of someone who believed he was pursuing the correct tactical response to their situation. The distance between them began to increase as Icarus's climb rate exceeded his father's ability to follow without placing additional stress on his own degrading wing system. The formation they had maintained throughout their journey was breaking apart just when coordination and mutual support were most critical for their survival. The partnership that had carried them successfully across hundreds of miles of open water was dissolving under the pressure of their emergency circumstances. Higher altitudes brought Icarus into direct contact with solar radiation that had been partially filtered during their lower level flight. The intensity of thermal energy at this elevated position was beyond anything their wing systems had been designed to handle, creating conditions that would accelerate material failure beyond any possibility of compensation or adaptation. The young man's artificial wings began to show visible signs of catastrophic degradation as individual feathers separated from their mountings and drifted away on the thermal currents. The carefully crafted surfaces that had provided lift and control throughout their journey were disappearing piece by piece, leaving behind the skeletal frameworks that could no longer support the aerodynamic forces required for sustained flight. Icarus seemed unaware of the magnitude of the destruction occurring around him. His attention focused on the exhilarating sensation of soaring higher than any human had ever flown before. The young man's face showed pure joy and wonder as he approached what he believed to be the realm of the gods themselves, not recognizing that he was actually ascending toward his own destruction. The wax that remained on his wings had now liquefied completely under the intense solar heating, forming droplets that caught the sunlight like scattered jewels before falling away toward the sea far below. Each drop represented a small piece of the structural integrity that was keeping him aloft, and their loss created a cascade of failures that would soon render controlled flight impossible. Daedalus screamed his son's name across the thermal currents that separated them, his voice carrying all the desperation and love of a father watching his child approach mortal danger. The sound was lost in the rushing of wind and the thermal turbulence that surrounded them, failing to penetrate the euphoric trance that had captured Icarus's attention completely. The young man's wings were now shedding feathers in a continuous stream, creating a trail of golden plumage that marked his path through the sky like scattered stars. The destruction was accelerating as each lost feather reduced the overall structural integrity and placed additional stress on the remaining components, creating a feedback loop that would culminate in total system failure. Time seemed to slow as the inevitable approached with the certainty of natural law. The sun that had enabled their navigation was about to claim its price for their presumption in entering its domain, teaching a lesson about the boundaries between human ambition and divine authority that would echo through the ages as a warning to all who sought to transcend the limitations of their mortal nature. The stage was set for the final act of their aerial drama, as the accumulated effects of heat and hubris converged to transform triumph into tragedy, success into sorrow, and the flight of dreams into the fall that would give meaning to countless generations of stories about the delicate balance between reaching for the heavens and remembering one's place upon the earth. And so we reach the end of this ancient tale, one that has whispered across millennia about the eternal dance between ambition and wisdom, between the soaring dreams of youth and the hard-earned caution of experience. As you drift towards sleep, let the story of Icarus remind you that our greatest achievements often carry within them the seeds of our most profound lessons. The Mediterranean sun that witnessed their flight continues to shine upon us today, offering the same promise of illumination and the same warning about flying too close to its transformative power. Rest now, knowing that dreams themselves are not dangerous, only the forgetting of our human limits as we pursue them.